If you can get a good framework for what they think and what they process and what they feel, which is a big thing, especially on the golf course, then it's way easier. And that's where I think those feels always navigate back towards pivot stuff for me personally.
Welcome to the cGolfcDriven show, where we are driven to get better at golf and learn more about improvement too. Today I'm talking to Jackson Koert of the Atlantic Beach Country Club. He's the director of instruction there. Thank you, Jackson, for joining me. He's also a top-ranked young instructor. Thanks for joining me, Jackson.
Colin, thanks for having me, man. Pleasure to be here.
So today we're talking about different fundamentals in the golf swing that are important for every golfer. You know, you often see tour pros, they're not working on big swing changes. They're often working on one or two fundamentals that really helps them get dialed in. It's not, something that they're always tinkering. It's just trying to get back to that, baseline where they're always dialed in. So I know that's something you work with your players a lot. You do a lot of work with players on their pivot. Can you explain to me, how does the pivot relate to the golf swing? How does it work?
So, really good question and a big topic for me. I am a big pivot teacher. I kind of think that's like the linchpin for getting better and having consistency, right? But the precursor to having a good pivot is you have to have a good setup, right? Like you had mentioned before as well, talking about balance, and I do a ton of stuff with balance because to me, I think if you can get someone set up correctly, meaning they got all their fundamentals in line, their grip, their ball position, and all that stuff, and then they're in an athletic posture and balance for themselves, because everybody's a little bit different, right? And there's tons of different body types. But if they're able to move well, then it's really important to develop a pivot, because to me, golf's a rotational sport. So if you can learn to turn back and turn through, that's the engine of the golf swing. And oftentimes, if you're set up good and you're ready to move, and then you do move well, it's really easy to have, number one, consistency, which we all want no matter what level you are. So that's kind of your foundation. And then I think once the pivot's well established, it's much easier to work on club stuff from there. Every now and then it kind of goes the opposite order, but most of the time I've found that if you get somebody moving well, that the club is much easier to maintain or even tweak if you need to, where oftentimes the club will respond to what the body's doing. Right. Okay. So a lot of times I don't really care what the club's doing until the body's moving good. And then we kind of dive a little bit deeper into that. Every now and then you get somebody that responds a little bit differently, where you get them set up and their pivot doesn't really click. And then you start talking about the club stuff and their pivot responds. So sometimes it's a little bit of a balance there, but I mainly go heavy into pivot first.
Okay. Do you work with the pivot with all your players, or are there some players that show up and you're like, oh, you got this, and you move on from there? Or is it, you start with everybody there?
Really good question. Probably a little bit more player specific there.
Okay.
I see it. I see the golf swing as a pivot or a shape or a motion, regardless of who's in front of me. But I think what you touched on earlier about good players and professional players compared to, amateurs or somebody that's trying to get better like yourself, I think it's very important to just understand your tendencies, right? Good players have tendencies. And I'm thinking about a guy who's a draw player, right? So if he plays 4 tournaments in a row, or he's playing 7 out of 8 weeks, he kind of works himself back into these tendencies all the time, which for a draw player ends up being a block and a hook, right? So he leaves it out to the right because he's right-handed, or it over curves to the left. And then, those are his misses. But for, somebody that's a 22 handicap that's trying to, shoot low 80s and break 80, their tendencies might be different. And you're just going to see maybe a worse shot pattern. But I think I would always kind of start with that pivot. And I had a good player tell me this once, not my own words, but he said when we started working, it took him kind of 6 or 9 months to kind of understand basically my process and the way I saw things. And then from there, he was able to kind of repeat it on his own, and he almost needs me less because he's kind of started to narrow down his scope of what he's working on, and then he just kind of stays between the guardrails. Yeah. But I thought that was a great way to see it. And on my end, yes, that's important for the player to understand that too. But I have to also understand their picture, which is I kind of what I think what you're talking about early on when I'm working with somebody. No matter where they are, if you can get a good like framework for what they think and what they process and what they feel, which is a big thing, especially on the golf course, then it's way easier. And that's where I think those feels always navigate back towards pivot stuff for me personally.
Okay. Now, how's the pivot? How does that relate to like things like ground contact and like face strike?
Okay, so
Does it really affect it too much, or I would assume it, like you said, it was maybe
a
bringing
ton.
more consistency. Yeah.
Yeah, a ton. And everybody moves a little bit different, right? Like if you were to think about some professional golfers, you think about maybe like a JB Holmes or a Bubba Watson or Henrik Stenson, right? They have a lot of early load or load into their trail side where you'd see on the swing catalyst or the force plates, you'd see more pressure and maybe even more mass because there's a difference between those two, but you'd see more of that moving into their trail side in the backswing. Well, all of those guys need more lateral coming into the ball so they're not behind it, right? But then if you look at somebody that's a little bit more front post or like, a vast majority of my club golfers that don't move super well, they're going to be a little bit more centered or a little bit more on their front side in the backswing. And so that lateral motion isn't as necessary. Um, so to me, if you get wound up and you're able to unwind, that's where it's easier for you to control your low point, which is
Mhm.
always the first thing, right? Because oftentimes in a lesson, dispersion wise, I don't care where it goes right away. Like if somebody's hitting it fat and thin, I would understand those are always the same thing, right? Like if for whatever reason, let's say somebody's a little bit behind the ball with their pivot, right? Their mass is a little bit on their trail side. And so they hit a couple fat ones and they don't want to do that again. So then they adjust and then the club raises and they hit it thin. Like your fat and your thin shot, everybody thinks they're different things, but it's not. It's just having your low point too far behind the golf ball. Well, that's easy. Let's figure out why your low point's behind the golf ball, get it in front of it so you can hit it solid, and then fixing dispersion left to right becomes much easier. So yes, in terms of pivot, that's a big piece of the puzzle early on to creating good contact. And again, consistency as well. Like because from there, I think if the contact's good, then your dispersion, like I said, is easier to work on. Doesn't matter if you're hitting a fade or a draw.
Now, say someone's watching this and they're like, "Oh, I should work on my pivot. This is important." Is there something like someone could do at home that would be easy for them to like check to see or like to get started working on their pivot? Something easy for us to get started with.
Yeah, phenomenal. When I was at Frederica, Davis Love was one of the guys that founded that club. So I was fortunate to get to know Davis a little bit, and I saw him all the time when he'd come out and practice. And I'm talking every time he came out to the club, before he ever hit a golf ball, he would always grab the mirror and make some swings in front of the mirror. So what you're saying about doing something at home is phenomenal for every golfer. If you can get a good framework, and I'm happy to help, or you find your local pro, but you find a good framework for your setup, and then you have a good understanding of what you're trying to do, maybe pivot wise or movement wise, face on and down the line. I think you can see pivot in both of those angles. And then you can do it in a mirror so that you can actually see what it feels like. That's an easy way for you to bridge that gap to the practice tee, right? Because recreational golfers and pros, to be honest, like they don't want their feels to be different every day,
Yeah,
right? Or searching, right? Maybe is another way to say it, but they don't want to be searching for the things that gives them predictability over strike and ball flight. So if you can do some stuff at home to get that, yes, I would encourage that wholeheartedly. And to create a little bit of a picture for that, I'm a sucker for a centered pivot, which basically means like I like seeing the buttons on your shirt and your belt buckle, right? Imagine that being your post or your spine that you're turning around in the backswing and that you're maybe turning around going through the golf ball as well. So I like seeing a really stable base with lower body. I like to see a steady head, and then I like to see that movement just working around your spine. And it's probably hard to describe through podcast, but like if anybody has questions or something, I'd be happy to show you a couple drills that's really simple for you to see and then also feel. Because I think if you can do stuff in a mirror, maybe even without a club first, you get those feels a little bit more tangible that you can touch on, and then you put a club in there and it should be able to translate a little bit quicker.
Now, do you ever see like some players where like their backswing, like their pivot in the backswing looks great, and then they're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're like unwinding? Or is it kind of usually if they're struggling in one area, they're struggling in both? Or like even like someone who can unwind really well, but they just struggle getting, their backswing loaded up?
See it all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good recipe there. If you're struggling with contact to start, it's always good to teach yourself how to go through the golf ball, right? Like a lot of my lessons with beginners or higher handicaps is stuff with a pitching wedge where you're learning to hit pitch shots and small shots first, because that foundation is the same when you start to grow it in size and speed. And if you can't sit there with a wedge and hit like a rib to rib 40-yard pitch shot or a shoulder to shoulder 80-yard shot, you're probably going to struggle with it, with an 8-iron or a 7-iron at full speed. So why not start there? And if you can learn to do it slow and then you increase those speeds, yes. So oftentimes, not all the time, because golf is never black and white. It's always gray, unfortunately. But yeah, most of the time with higher handicaps, it's great to start with through swing stuff. Teach them what it's like, to have. I'm a fan of lag, which to me is Chuck Cook talks about it as a sequence thing, where it's the body first, and then the arms, and then the club. And so
Okay.
if the body's going forward and around, that's going to be pulling your arms. And if your arms are being pulled by your trunk, that's going to be pulling the shaft. The grip is leading the shaft and then leading the club. And it's going to be easier for you to put the low point in front of the golf ball. Right. So starting with that stuff, with higher handicaps, I tend to have a little bit more success. And then if you give them that feel where they're striking it solid and they've got some confidence, because that's your magic 8 ball in golf, is a little bit of confidence, no matter how good you are. And then if you can tie that up with their backswing, I think they're going to be off to the races.
Awesome. So you touched on balance a little bit, and like I think balance is really key for anybody's swing, is especially in mine, where like I feel like I tend to get a little out of balance like front to back, versus I know some people they'll like sway more and like
Yep.
more lateral. Can you touch on why balance is important and maybe like how to work on it too?
Okay, so it's important for that movement, right? We've got a 15, 16-month-old baby who's running around like crazy right now. But when she trips, we didn't have to teach her to stick her arms out to balance herself, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, she'd fall over and hurt her head. And that's just a movement principle. You're always trying to protect your head, right? So that's having your spine underneath your head so that you can have stability and balance. And that's why in the golf swing, I like a centered pivot, because I think if you're centered, then it's going to be much imbalanced, kind of the same thing. Then it's going to be easier for you to create rotational speed. But if you're out of balance, like you're saying, where somebody would be falling towards their toes, they're not
Yeah.
going to be able to create as much rotation from there. So you're going to try and see them balancing out. And that's when the pivot would stall. And that's when contact and all that stuff suffers. So yes, that balance aspect is massive, not only at address to create that movement, but the balance in the backswing, right? However you load up, and then also your balance going through. So sometimes it's a physical limitation, right? Where somebody might have poor ankles or poor hips, where they're not either stable enough, because to create range of motion, you have to have stability to create mobility, right?
Okay.
You can have somebody that's super mobile, but if they don't have stability, then they're not going to be able to utilize that. But if you can create stability in the ground, then you can add that mobility on top of it. It's just like pulling back a rubber band and letting that thing go, right?
Yeah.
So we did some work up in Philly at Bluebell. Tony teaches this brain surgeon, neurosurgeon guy, super smart, really cool podcast on Tony's about that and learning. But I was helping Tony with him, and he talked about how for if you're an older individual, like I use those balance discs all the time. Actually doesn't like the balance discs for somebody that's a little bit older because you lose stability. So that's where it would be something a little bit less than that, where we use like a 2x4 under their arches all the time. That's way better for somebody a little bit older, or even just an alignment stick under your feet. Like if it was under the arches of your feet where the balls of your feet are on the ground and the heels of your feet are on the ground, so you can feel that stick underneath your feet. All right, that's a better way for them to feel it. But then I've got, a handful of juniors that are, they swing it faster than they weigh. Right. And like I'm
Yeah.
always trying to get stability with them because they're creating all the speed and their feet are all over the place. Right. So for them, I think, and the doctor was talking about this too, where you can use those balance discs or the harder constraints, which gives them better feedback. So it's finding kind of the right click for you within that balance framework. But yeah, we use balance discs all the time because if you create an unstable surface, if you're on something unstable, you have to use your like small muscles and your stabilizers to create stability and balance. And then once you get that feel and you go to the ground, then it's like your feet are in concrete, right? And then moving from there is really easy.
Now, for like your younger players on the balance discs, after they use that, or like after they improve, do you see like their speed increases, and or they just feel more comfortable at that
Mm,
high speed?
good question. So in a lesson, I struggle with the coaching model sometimes because you see somebody for an hour, looks better on camera, looks better on TV, you pat them on the back and they walk out the door, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not necessarily them getting better at golf. Now, I know we all want to hit it further, right? But I think coaching to me is being able to like work with somebody a little bit more consistently so that you're just helping them monitor those tendencies, right?
Okay.
So to answer your question, in that small hour time period that I get with a junior, or somebody like yourself, like an athletic younger individual that's played other sports and maybe frustrated that they're not hitting it solid and further than they should, in that hour time period, I think it's more important to create that stability in the feel and develop the pivot and then give them that feeling that creates better contact or response in the ball for consistency and dispersion, whatever you're looking for. Because from there, if they understand what they're doing and how to do it, then they'll be able to do it on their own and the speed will go through the roof. But it's, you know, getting better at golf is never linear. It's
Yeah.
kind of like, this whole thing. So I would say in the small time period that I get with somebody, most of the time I'm not really concerned about the speed. I
Yeah.
think if I'm able to see them over a longer period of time, then yes, I am more concerned about the speed. But like if I had somebody walk into a lesson with me and I could sprinkle on 10 miles an hour clubhead speed every lesson, I'd be charging triple what I do and I'd be living on an island somewhere. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's the way I would answer that question is like look at it more as a marathon, not a sprint. And if you have a good understanding of what you're trying to do and how to do it, you should see the speed increase. Maybe not in that first hour, but if you continue to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I wasn't sure if like after working with juniors over a lot, I meant like a longer period. But are there
Oh
any
yeah,
other
for
like
sure. Over a longer period,
yeah,
yes, you better see the speed increases.
okay. Now, are there any other fundamentals that you think we should touch on and that you
Yeah,
think are important?
you know, besides your setup and besides pivot stuff, I think it's easier to create speed with a square club face,
Okay.
right? And square to me is like if you had the idea of that plane line in the backswing. I like the club face to be matching someone's spine angle in the backswing and then kind of seeing that club face square to their left wrist or kind of matching their left arm in the backswing. And then also kind of coming down on a similar line, still with a square club face. Because then I think from there they'll be able to create that rotational speed. Because if you get somebody with an open club face. Like Tony always says, the only thing you want open is a po' boy. Like, pretty dang true. Because if you've got an open club face and you have great movement and really good rotation and you're adding forward shaft lean, that club is actually going to be more open. Nobody wants that, right? So then they're going to slow down their pivot and do something to get that club face back square. So I think after your setup and after the pivot, that's when I'm very keen on the club face, the orientation of it, and essentially how they deliver that.
Okay, so like, would there be what? So maybe you don't know this, but like, why would some coaches prefer to coach it not to have a square face, or like, why would is it just player tendencies, or
For sure. If you get somebody, I've got a kid that just graduated college and he's playing professional golf now. His club face is a little bit more open than my preference, but he's already really good.
yeah,
So would I mess with that? Probably not. And he's a draw player, right? So if you're a right-handed golfer and you're going to play a draw, obviously that club face has to be open to the target just slightly so that the ball starts to the right. So that, I think that's where it came from for him, because he's a skinnier guy, creates a bunch of speed, but he's got a little bit of a different release pattern than I would teach. But I only started working with him, a year ago, and he's already really good. So I'm probably not going to mess with that too much. Um, and then, yeah, there's some people that like to see a lot of arm or hand speed, and they would coach maybe different release styles or release patterns, which I go into sometimes with people. It actually might go back towards like, your more recreational or beginner player where they might not know how to deliver a club face properly based on their motion. Like if you've got somebody with if you have somebody with slow hip turn, right, where they're not turning a bunch through the golf ball, and you had a very strong grip or very strong club face, that's likely to make some left shots. So that's one place where you might actually want to see maybe a little weaker grip or maybe a slightly more open club face. But understanding that the difference in the club face is very minimal.
yeah.
Right, the corridor that it needs to live in, I don't think is super wide. You know, but yeah, I'm a sucker for a square face.
It probably just seems like it keeps things a little bit more simple and
Yeah,
easier to manage, probably, right?
yeah. And then skill wise, like I think those three buckets are very common for an hour lesson: setup stuff, pivot stuff, club stuff. Right, like, and if you can get maybe one thing in each of those, that's a lot. Those are three things to work on. But outside of that, like to me, that's teaching. But coaching is a little bit different. And golf is the only sport that's practiced on a field it's not played on. Football, baseball, basketball, everything's the same. But then golf, you're hitting balls on a flat lie all the time, no consequences, and then you go out down to the golf course, and the only flat lie you've got is on a tee box, right? And then everything else is different. So if you can do skill development, Cordy Walker loves this stuff,
Yeah,
skill development stuff, right? If you can learn skills, which might be like more into shots, right? Like what shot are you playing? Not what swing are you trying
yeah,
to maintain or to get better at. What shot are you trying to pull off? I think that skill development actually goes a long ways in transferring stuff from the range to the golf course. And that's maybe sometimes just a matter of understanding, right? Like conceptually trying to understand some of those things when you're on the golf course, or just developing them. Like, can you hit a stick and punch shot? Can you hit a wedge shot from 60 yards? Can you hit a bunker shot? Like simple stuff like that. That actually comes up more when you're on the golf course than when you're standing on a teaching tee with your local pro.
awesome, awesome. Well, thank you, Jackson, for joining me today. If anyone wanted to get in touch with you for a lesson, where could they find you?
Yeah, easiest way right now is probably just through Instagram at Jackson K Golf. I'm also on Skillest too, but yeah, feel free to shoot me a message. I'm always happy to help. I love golf, I really do, and I'm a nerd for it. And if I can do anything to help anybody, I'm all ears all the time.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. Be driven, everybody. How'd you get into coaching golf, and how'd you end up at Atlantic Beach Country Club?
Yeah, so have a pretty eclectic journey into the golf world. I grew up in Michigan and actually grew up on an apple farm in the middle of nowhere, and golf kind of became an escape. I would finish my chores on the farm and I would hop on my bike and cruise to it's called like the Moose Lodge or the Elks Club, like the old good old boys drinking club. And this one in particular just happened to have a 9-hole golf course, and it was a complete dog track, just terrible, right? But all the guys that I would play golf with were the regulars there. But that's just kind of how I got into the game of golf, and was fortunate enough to kind of develop as a junior player and be able to play in college down in Florida, and stayed down there for a little while, tried to play professionally, did some caddying on the side as well. And then I got into coaching down there with a guy that was going back and forth between, ironically, Michigan and Florida. And flash forward a couple of years, got married, and knew again that I kind of needed basically mentorship if I wanted to take the golf instruction thing seriously. So moved my wife of 7, 8 months from Michigan to Alabama to work for Tony Ruggiero, who I worked for in Alabama for 4 years, 3.5 years. And then he staffed me at Frederica Golf Club on St. Simon's Island, was there for a little over 3 years, and then just about 18 months ago became director of instruction at Atlantic Beach Country Club. So back in Florida again, and not mad about it, minus a hurricane every now and then, but we're doing good.
Congrats on that. That's definitely a lot of airline miles going back and forth
Right.
everywhere.